We're back, we're live, we're ThinkTech Talks here on a given Thursday, and we have a most interesting show for you today about Indigenous leadership. And with us to discuss that is Dr. Michelle Evans, a research fellow at the Asia Pacific Social Impact Leadership Center in Melbourne. Actually, it's in Carlton, Victoria.
That's right.
Carlton is
Melbourne.
The city.
It's a little suburb, part of Melbourne.
Okay, all right, we'll say Greater Melbourne.
Greater Melbourne, yeah, true.
So, thank you for coming on the show, Michelle.
My pleasure. Thanks for the invite.
Great to have you here. This is really an important discussion. We here in Hawaii can learn a lot from what you're doing. So, Michelle is navigating the territories of Indigenous leadership, exploring the experiences and practices of Australian Indigenous arts leaders in particular. And she is herself an Indigenous person, an Aboriginal Australian. Do you ever count percentages the way they do in Hawaii? Blood percentages or anything like that?
It's one of the things that we find quite racist, a racist kind of regime in Australia. So it's more about identity. There's a tripartite definition in Australia that's held by the Australian government. So, you know, it's disputable as well. But the idea that you are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, that you claim the identity and live the identity, and that you're accepted by the community in which you live as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander. So it's much more about the social construction of identity than it is about blood quantum.
Yeah. So you, I mean, but are there Aboriginal people who with Aboriginal blood who don't tell you that? They don't tell the public.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is this issue around people who are much more darker skin as compared to lighter skin Aboriginal people, and there's this really, it's a big debate in Australia around Aboriginality and who can decide who's Aboriginal. The kind of definition of Aboriginality, as I said, because it's kind of touted by the Australian government, is really out there in the public domain for everyone to talk about at all times. And so people can talk about who I am at all times as much as I can. So it's really this kind of...
it's a national heritage, isn't it?
It's very
it belongs
much about
to everyone.
That. It does, but it's also about this self-determination, as you know, from Hawaii, you know, this idea about being an Indigenous person, being able to self-determine my identity is important as well, and not being kind of being offended by people who are saying, no, you're not, you don't look this way, you're not, you know, living in the outback, living in some remote communities, you're not kind of acting this kind of mythologized or stigmatized idea about what an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person should look like, should be like. You know, one of my great friends, she talks about she's got Westfield dreaming. Westfield's a supermarket or shopping centre in Australia, rather than, you know, being this idea that we've got spirituality that is connected in other ways. And the whole thing is that we get into this area where it's either one or the other, and that it becomes this real plural kind of paradoxical thing. You're either authentic or you're not. You're either urban or you're remote. And you know, there's just such a wonderful diversity about being Aboriginal in Australia these days. We've got over 500 nations in Australia, which is quite different to, you know, when
500 Aboriginal nations?
Yes.
How interesting.
It is, and it's very diverse all across Australia. Such a big place. But, you know, colonisation has had a very big impact, of course, and you know, that's a whole different kind of tale that we could talk about. But I think a lot of people tend to think about, you know, New Zealand and the Maori peoples and try and compare them to Aboriginal people in Australia. here you have a unified language in New Zealand, and you have many parts of it a unified culture. In Australia, you have 500 diverse nations, very, very different languages. So it's just much more diverse and very different again. So I think the whole idea about being Aboriginal in Australia today is about how you assert your identity, how you are connected to community. And I think because the identity is so hotly debated all the time and in the public domain, that becomes, being able to perform and do that identity work is a form of leadership. And that's what I've found from the work that I've done with Indigenous artists.
I'm curious, for one digression, is it how did you get into this work? I mean, tell us a little about your own biography.
Sure. So I'm from the Hunter Valley in New South Wales, which is kind of northwest of Sydney, and I grew up there. When I was about 13, my grandfather was dying, and I didn't grow up with him, and my mother went to visit him on his deathbed, and he told her about our Aboriginality. So I found out then, and it completely made my world.
You didn't know until
I didn't know until I was about
interesting.
13.
How old were you then?
13.
Yes, okay.
And so it was like my world completely made sense for me, and the Aboriginal community around the Hunter Valley and Newcastle areas just completely took us up as a family, and we were just really much a part of the entire community.
So what was your reaction?
It was
to
just
find
like,
this is a big thing for a young girl to find, you know. It's an identity thing.
It completely was.
So how did it affect you?
It just made complete sense to me. We lived in quite poor housing kind of commission, government built houses, area of Cessnock, and my father's a nurse, my mother's disabled, she lives at home, and you know, we were out in the bush all the time. So for me, it made complete sense. And also there was a sense of belonging. We had this community that was there for us, and this whole culture that we were a part of and that we could learn about, and the knowledge exchange and the elders taking us in was just an extraordinary thing for me.
So when you say makes sense, you mean this is something that resonated
completely,
where you realized that, gee whiz, you know, this is something I should have known.
Exactly.
Because it all works for me.
It totally worked for me.
Okay.
Yeah. And so I think, you know, from there, you know, I was very interested in all of working in the arts. I wanted to be a theatre director, so I went and did a theatre degree for my bachelor course, but I also got involved in student politics. And
what school?
I was at Charles Sturt University, which is a regional part in New South Wales at Bathurst, and I loved doing my theatre, and I got out of that and went home back to Newcastle, and you know, it was very hard to get a job. Imagine, you're a theatre undergraduate. There should be jobs everywhere, right? Wrong.
Maybe on Broadway.
The thing that I found was everyone wanted you to have management in your resume as an artist, to have this management. So I went and did an arts management degree, and seriously have not been out of a job since. But what I noticed,
it worked.
It completely worked. And it's this magic of this word, management. What does it mean? But also this kind of tension between, am I here to create artistic work and live as an artist, or am I here to manage mine or other people's art, and how does that frustrate me?
What did you settle on?
Well, I kind of found this interim place, I called a cultural producer, where I could bring together a whole thing and start setting up new organisations. So that's what I focused on, setting up a radio station, in fact, in Melbourne, Melbourne's first Indigenous radio station called Three Cool and Deadly. And
say it again.
Three Cool and Deadly.
Three Cool and Deadly.
Yeah, deadly is an Aboriginal kind of slang word which means awesome, excellent.
It means the same thing.
It does?
I think so.
Excellent. Deadly. And then I was a part of setting up the Willan Centre for Indigenous Arts and Cultural Development, and that was at one of our preeminent arts training institutions in Australia called the Victorian College of the Arts. And that really, for me, was amazing, because I could think about a 7-year sort of strategy to bring more and more Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander artists through an arts training institution. Because what we notice, certainly in the arts, is that graduate education kind of can propel, especially, you know, visual artists, but also performing artists, careers quite amazingly. One, they get hooked into networks that they didn't have before. They get access to studio and people to choreograph on or to direct that they would have to pay for outside. So
it's a big incentive to keep on doing it.
And you're creating new work.
Yeah.
And that's what I was really interested in. How can we kind of kickstart in another way the Indigenous arts industry in Australia? From all these young artists, how can we support them to create new work?
So what you have a PhD?
I do now,
In what area?
Got it through the Melbourne Business School, but it's in leadership. So what, as I said about that word management.
As a subject.
As a subject, yeah.
Okay, all right.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah, you
good,
can.
good. Well, I want to talk to you more about leadership in general. But,
sure.
Yeah. So if I had to define this from what you've said and what I've seen in the email, is you are into, and this is not necessarily an order of importance, but leadership.
Yes.
And that means management also. Part of the same thing. And then it's Indigenous art. Yes. Of all kinds, theater and other kinds as well.
Yeah, filmmaking, community arts, all of it.
Okay, and your mission seems to be to raise up Indigenous arts through good leadership and put that, on the radar for the country, for Australia.
Yes. And internationally.
And
one of the reasons I'm here in the United States of America is to replicate my PhD study and interview Indigenous artists here. And of course, you've got very diverse Indigenous peoples across the USA. We spent 10 weeks in Alaska interviewing first Alaskan. Yeah, we're sometime in California and New York interviewing American Indian artists, and here now to interview Native Hawaiian artists about their work, but also about the way in which they practice, and then trying to understand leadership by thinking about the way they enact their values through their work.
I always ask myself whether the Indigenous movement, which is pretty robust in many places in the world, is a movement which seeks to, and maybe it's a combination, but which seeks to influence events and politics and development going forward, be more active part of the community going forward, or to memorialize, document, preserve the culture that it celebrates.
Yes.
So which side of that are you on, or are we talking about both sides?
I think both sides, definitely. And perhaps there's even another bit which is about resisting the mainstream altogether and creating an Indigenous only space, which I see a lot of that happening across the world. And that's important, working in contemporary mainstream society and creating, the communication in a bicultural way is important. And supporting leaders to come up and really, as you say, practice language and material culture every day. That is such an important part of it as well. So there's so many different kind of ways to be. It always seems to me, what drives a person? Are they doing things in spite of what happens? Are they doing things despite that? I'm going to do it. Or is it because of that? I'm doing this. And and that's what I've really noticed through talking with Indigenous artists about their work, is you can kind of really start to hear what drives a person, and so certainly in managing people, you want to know that sort of little fire to light under people. How can you get them working?
Sure, and make them understand, the sort of the basic principles involved in moving forward. We're going to take a short break, but when we come back, a couple of things I'd like to, sort of give you an idea that I'd like to discuss. And that is, one is the dynamic of this in the societies that you've seen and are seeing on your trip, and exactly, you know, what the tension is between that dynamic and the idea that intermarriage is happening just as, you know, everywhere.
Sure.
So how do you deal with that, and how do you know, continue the celebration in face of it? Okay? We're going to take a short break. Dr. Michelle Evans from Melbourne, I'm shortcutting that, in Australia, an Asia Pacific Social Impact Leader, a member of the Asia Pacific Social Impact Leadership Center. She's here on a trip to observe leadership and Aboriginal leadership, Indigenous leadership in the arts. And we've only started our discussion. We'll be right back for more.
We want to thank our underwriters.
Hawaiian Electric Company and its affiliates Maui Electric on Maui and Hawaii Electric Light Company on Hawaii Island are deeply committed to the communities they serve.
Galen Ho is a senior executive of BAE Systems, a global defense, security, and aerospace company.
The High-Tech Development Corporation, the state's leading technology agency, attached to the Department of Business, Economic Development, and Tourism.
Castle and Cook Hawaii, with a time-honored legacy that spans more than 160 years and revolves around its mission of investing in Hawaii, creating communities, and providing for the needs of our state.
Hawaii Gas, formerly the Gas Company, a proponent of the Liquefied Natural Gas Initiative, helping Hawaii achieve its transition to clean energy and a better energy future.
Collateral Analytics, a Hawaii-based tech company empowering the real estate industry with greater and faster access to the tools and data they need to make better informed property investment decisions.
I'm Nicole Horry. Thanks so much for joining us on ThinkTech.
I'm Maria Kashem. See you next time.
Okay, we're back. We're live. I'm Jay Fidell. Welcome to ThinkTech Talks on a given Thursday in the 3 to 4 block. And we have with us a very interesting guest, Dr. Michelle Evans, a research fellow at the Asia Pacific Social Impact Leadership Center in Melbourne, Australia. And she's here to look into the way Indigenous leadership works, because we have that. And the comparison must be very interesting for you. So before the break, I said I'm, you know, sort of curious about the dynamic of it. You know, by no means is any of this static.
Absolutely.
It's changing while you watch. It's not only changing in Australia, it's changing in Hawaii, it's changing all over the world.
Yes.
And there is a notable rise of Indigenous consciousness, awareness, but there's also you know, the tension, as I mentioned before the break, the tension between that and intermarriage.
Yes.
And I wonder if you have thoughts on that. Where does that fit? How do those two things work together?
Yeah. I mean, maybe I'll take it into one of the areas that I'm working in, which is around Indigenous entrepreneurship. In Australia, we've really followed the US through your Minority Suppliers Council, trying to encourage more Indigenous businesses to rise up. I would say, you know, up until about 5 years ago, it was quite a small, but still robust self-employment sector, but not very much. And now we've got this kind of Minority Suppliers Council, and it's encouraging. Why I connect it to what you just asked is one of the key issues is how do you brand an Indigenous business? And what people have settled on across the country is that it has to be 51% ownership Indigenous. So what happens to married couples who own a business, which obviously there's a lot of these type of businesses all around where it's an Indigenous and a non-Indigenous marriage, and it's actually caused
The woman gets the 51%. That's the way it works in my house.
That's the way it works, right. I'm going to kind of go back and tell them all about that. But, you know, this whole idea about, you know, one person will have a slightly bigger share and the other won't, and you know, the tension that causes, of course, has been a really interesting kind of dilemma to watch. I mean, it's obviously easier for corporations who can have shares if they want to be publicly traded, but you know, we're talking about small businesses really. So I think, you know, these are big deals, and as you know, Indigenous people in Australia, certainly, and why I'm really interested in the business side, moving from arts more broadly, because a lot of artists are entrepreneurs anyway, every day of the week, aren't they? Fantastic entrepreneurs,
Yes.
making money as they should be. So the leap into the business space isn't that big, but it seems like this kind of really strange, alternative universe for myself to be in business. But
You didn't start in business.
Not at all.
You started in the arts.
I started
Now, that's
in
on
theatre.
the left brain side, and the business is on the right brain, or something along
That's
those
right. But I think, the entrepreneurship thing is really about these people who create from nothing. So as a theatre maker who worked in kind of poor theatre where you really did have nothing and you're creating a new play from that.
So that's the common point, isn't
Absolutely.
it? The creativity.
And it's improvisation, and
Yeah.
it's collaboration,
Yes.
and it's being open,
Yes.
and it's all of those things that really...
These are the building blocks of community,
I
and,
believe so.
for that matter, success.
I think so, and being really open to what can happen. So what I've noticed now working with Indigenous small business owners is this idea that in Australia there aren't a lot of Aboriginal business owners who have business degrees. So access to business education is really important, I think, because
And it can be after the fact.
absolutely.
While the enterprise is going on.
And this is what we're focused on, because trying to build a pipeline of young people to get interested in science and technologies, and then eventually pick economics, and then eventually come into an MBA, and then eventually become a corporation CEO, is a very, very long kind of train. So I've jumped in and created a program at the Melbourne Business School for Indigenous entrepreneurs who are already trading, and they come and they do 6 two-day masterclasses in each of the different areas
Including technology and innovation businesses?
Innovation, marketing, finance, management, all
That's
the
great.
basic
That's great.
business
It probably
blocks.
helps them a lot, because it's the school of hard knocks can only take you so far.
Indeed,
You
it
have
can.
to have some book learning after a while.
I think so, and really what I found, it's always less about, and this is the leadership person in me, less about the content, more about creating a place for learning to happen from each other, and they will find the networks that they didn't have before to support and start trading with each other. All sorts of kind of outcomes that come from
So
this
you act
work.
as an exchange. In
Well-
other words, is it more than teaching? Is it, look, we taught you what we know, we gave you the class and the master class, but now you can call us, you can write us, you can come around. We'll have gatherings. We'll act as a center, a hub of something.
We'll act as a sender. You drive it.
Yeah.
It's not for me to drive.
Yeah.
What I do is, and this is where I think the leadership stuff is really important, is I can create a space that can hold them for the time that they're there, and can become a really resonant, productive, inspirational place for them, because they're getting new content that they didn't have before, and new networks and all of these things. So I build a really rich resource environment, and then we'll see what happens.
So which is more important to your daily life, your career vision and all that? Is it the arts, or is it the entrepreneurs?
I think at the moment I'm really kind of liking this entrepreneurship space, to tell you the truth. I love doing my research with artists, because I'm an artist by background, and I love it. And I love to listen to people's stories. I'm a qualitative researcher, so I do long interviews with people. I get to know people, and I tend to work with my interviewees over 5 years. So
That's the period of time for
that's how I like to think
the
about
gestation,
it.
if you will.
Well, I like to collect an interview. Obviously, you transcribe it, but I like to hand it back, have a conversation, develop a profile. Then I'll do the work of analysing it, and then I'll pull it
And
back.
following it, because it changes.
Exactly,
Yeah.
and comparing it to everyone else's,
Yeah.
and then talking to the participants about all of that, sending them my writings about it, because I'm not authoring this alone. and that's the collaborator in me as a theatre maker. You know, I want to work with this whole group of people.
Yeah.
So whether it's the arts or creating a space for entrepreneurs, for me, it's about getting a crew to run with. You know, I need a crew to kind
So
of
you're
work
building a
with.
community.
Yeah.
How many people are in your community? I mean, can you give me a handle on that?
Which one? How many communities?
I'm
The entrepreneurs?
going to leave you to answer that question any way you want.
Sure. Oh, look, so many people. On my LinkedIn? No. In the entrepreneurs thing, I've got 30 alumni at the moment, and we've been running for 2 years, which is nice, and it's just great. I mean, they're friends of mine now, and for me it's about, as you say, building community and upholding people with a real positive regard. And you know, Aboriginal entrepreneurs or artists get knocked down every day by people of our own community or people in kind of mainstream society. I just see it as my job to uphold them or show them a mirror of how fantastic I think they are, and they are. I mean, I'm not just selling them a...
You're an unusual person.
Do you think?
Dr. Michelle Evans, yeah. But let me say this. It seems like, you know, you got this wired because you've come at it from, you know, grassroots. You've brought, you know, academia, discipline, and collective achievement to it. And so why exactly do you need to come to the U.S. and, you know, go from community to community here? I mean, what can these communities teach you?
Yeah.
And what can you teach? Well, I know what you can teach them.
Sure.
But I'd like to hear it both ways.
Yeah. Well, look, I must say, my partner and I just loved Alaska. So we were there. We were meant to only be there for 6 weeks. We loved it so much. We developed some great friends. Friends are coming to visit us from Alaska here in Hawaii. You know, it's just been this amazing time. But what I really learned there, because of, as I said, I'm from the Hunter Valley, which is in New South Wales, and when Captain Cook arrived, bless him, he decimated like a lot of that southeast area through colonisation, and obviously the English government did that. And
That was the original
the
colony in Australia?
Oh yeah.
Okay. Sydney.
And through Sydney, and so a lot of people are quite far away from practicing material culture and language every day. What I saw in Alaska of people teaching their children every day dance and talking in language every day, and being able to do the Athabascan beadwork every day. I could see, and it strengthened me culturally just to be a part of it and start to learn something quite different myself. And I really, I don't know, it just flipped a switch in me to say how important practicing every day is of your culture, and you know how being in mainstream Australia, living in Melbourne, I live down in the kind of western suburbs of Melbourne, but close to a beach, and I walk my dogs every day, and I do like just anyone will be doing in their house. I drive to work, I come home, I cook my dinner, but do I find time to try and learn my language? No. Do I find time to, look at my tribal area and see what sort of particular arts work there is and do that? No. So that really, I learned a lot from that, and I could see how contemporary artists are using skin work in their much more contemporary work that they're doing. So
what is skin work?
So like sewing salmon skin, like drying it out, going catching it first, number one. Mm-hmm. Wow. Mm-hmm. And then doing all of that, skinning it, drying that, curing it. What about this moose brain cured tanning of skin? I mean, just using every part of animals, this semi-subsistence lifestyle, really. It just kind of blew my mind, really.
And did you need to know this in order to understand the culture?
Yes.
I mean, you have to put yourself back in those times.
But it is now. And this is the thing that really, I'm like, I want to understand how artists are living and working now in Alaska, and how their identity and their work through their identity creates spaces for a leadership about Indigenous life now. How are they doing it? How are they leading?
So let's assume you learn a point of process, a point of, what's the word I'm looking for? But, you know, the way it works, okay, however you define that you hadn't seen before, that you hadn't seen in Australia. What do you do with that?
What do I do with that? For me, I'm thinking as I go back, like, certainly I really want to think about learning language and also dance, and being able to work in my community as a person who can bring something like that together, and not out of trying to build an organisation or that, but just get together at someone's house every Friday night, or you know what I mean, just make it a part of your week. It's a part of your life. It's not this thing that is just for show. It's not built up as a business, but it is actually just my life.
It sounds like it reinforces your life, your efforts, by knowing that in another place, a completely different Indigenous experience, the same, roughly, not exactly, but roughly the same thing is happening.
Most certainly.
And to go back to Australia and say, let me tell you what goes on in Alaska.
Yeah.
You know, it confirms, it supports,
yes,
it gives heart,
yes,
it invigorates your whole examination.
Yes.
You know, and with that, on that note, I want to take a short break. Okay. Yes. This is Dr. Michelle Evans, Research Fellow with the Asia Pacific Social Impact Leadership Center, where she is having impact, I think, in Melbourne, Australia. This is ThinkTech. I'm Jay Fidell. We'll be right back to discuss more about Indigenous leadership in the arts and in entrepreneurial activities. I'll be right back. Aloha, I'm Jay Fidell. This is ThinkTech Hawaii, broadcasting live from the Pioneer Plaza in downtown Honolulu. We raise public awareness about tech, energy, and globalism in Hawaii. Technology is critical to our state. A vibrant tech sector will give us new prospects in the global marketplace and will offer great careers and make our economy more resilient. Streaming live on Ustream and Spreaker, ThinkTech allows its hosts and guests invaluable opportunities to report important events and discuss important questions, and to be heard here in Hawaii and around the world. You can find links to our live streams on thinktechhawaii.com or on our mobile website, m.thinktechhawaii.com. And you can see our archive on YouTube. It's all just a click away. We want to do whatever we can to keep Hawaii relevant, connected, and thriving in the complexity of the 21st century. We hope you will help us in those efforts. Tune in today. This is ThinkTech. I'm Jay Fidell. Mahalo. We're back, we're live. We're here with Dr. Michelle Evans, Research Fellow at the Asia Pacific Social Impact Leadership Center in Melbourne, Australia, and she's on a tour around with the United States, I guess, looking for similar experiences, and that these are the experiences of navigating the Indigenous leadership issues, exploring the practices of Indigenous arts leaders, and with a view toward ascertaining the principles of leadership in that context, which is, leadership is important in all contexts,
Indeed.
you know, Michelle, but it's important here too. So one of the things you mentioned before the show, and I would like to cover, is some I guess it's legislation in Australia where there's a new Prime Minister. His name is Tony Abbott, and he is trying to amend an act relating to, I guess, to free speech. Can you tell us about that? What's happening?
Yeah, sure. So what's happening at the moment is the federal government, which is a Conservative government, is deciding to really amend the Racial Discrimination Act around what people can and can't say in terms of racism. And one of the things that...
This is a matter of...
it's huge.
But you guys have the First Amendment as much as we do.
No, we don't.
Oh, I want to hear about that.
Okay. So, yeah, I think the whole free speech kind of idea has been run because of America, and people are responsible in Australia for racism. Free speech, free speech and racism shouldn't be happening, and you should be actually, litigated against if you are racist, certainly in the public, in the media, in employment situations.
Well, I think
and
that's a
all of
modern
this.
approach.
And so, therefore, we've had this in Australia for many, many years. The Racial Discrimination Act protects people from racial discrimination, but also sexual harassment, all of these things, which is great. What seems to be running in the media is was it 2 years ago, a very kind of controversial shock jock media journalist decided to...
You have them? Eh?
Oh, we do. Not just the US.
Sounds like Murdoch, but never mind.
Right. He's from Melbourne.
I know.
He decided to run an argument about people who are of fairer skinned, who are Aboriginal and are doing quite well in terms of having jobs or making some money through the arts. And he racially discriminated against certain people, calling them white Aborigines and basically saying they only claim identity in order to make money. And he named several artists and kind of mainstream politicians and different community leaders in the papers over a series of articles. The people who were named in those articles took him to the federal court over racial discrimination.
On the claim that he had violated a statute.
Exactly.
Which says you can't do that. An act.
Exactly.
Okay.
And the Aboriginal plaintiffs won that case against, his name is Andrew Bolt. So now Bolt seems to have gotten in the pocket of Tony Abbott, and they're running this whole idea about, we need to reform the Racial Discrimination Act. People need to have access to be able to speak free speech.
Even if it's racist.
Exactly. And so one of the big deals, I think, about this particular act, and it was happening as I was doing my PhD, and a couple of the people who were involved as interviewees in my PhD were named in this particular, by this particular journalist, and were a part of taking him to court, is that they had to get up in front of the federal court and basically be cross-examined about who they were. They had to sit there and tell their entire life story. This doesn't happen to non-Indigenous people in Australia. This doesn't happen to anyone else in Australia, but it is happening to these Aboriginal people.
In a court.
In a court situation.
On the argument that somehow that was relevant.
Exactly. And why are you choosing to uphold your Aboriginal identity as compared to these other parts of who you are, and your other heritages? And I mean, just this whole idea, as I said at the beginning, that Aboriginal identity is out there in the public domain for everyone to talk about. Whereas as an Aboriginal person, I should be able to say who I am, rather than have other people tell me who I am or who I am not. So I think there's this really difficult situation that's happening in Australia at the moment. It's very, the idea is very racialised. It's very much about leadership. What do we have to manage inside of ourselves to do that?
Before we do that, I want to know that, but first I'd like you to tell me how you define leadership.
Sure. One of the big things, Jay, is that I'm not really interested in defining it, but I can talk a little bit about why. Leadership really comes, a lot of the leadership studies comes from out of military kind of studies of leadership, yeah?
That may or may not be helpful.
Exactly. And it's all, and very much about, and leadership is mostly studied in organisations. So it's all about kind of looking in places where there is very structured hierarchy. So when you ask people about leadership, we call it implicit leadership theories. If I ask you about leadership, you might tell me who you think a leader is. And therefore that kind of gives people an idea that a leader is someone who is above us, someone who has power over people. And so this is how it's studied. What I'm interested as a researcher is to say, if we were to peel that away, peel those ideas and assumptions about it, and just know that in the social process of working with people, leadership emerges because it's needed. That if we're working on a project, I might kind of emerge to lead this bit because I'm better at it, and you might do this bit because you're better at it. I mean, how does that emerge? How do we create that? It's between people that something happens. It's not about who is a leader, but I'm more interested in this kind of dynamics about how leadership emerges.
I understand, but it opens a whole very interesting discussion, especially in view of the way things are working in Washington these days.
Sure, most certainly.
And the elected leaders versus the real leaders. It's like there was a fellow developed a software program that could tell you in a given corporation, based on an examination of the email that went internecine around the corporation, he could tell you who was really running it, and it didn't matter who the appointed officials were. Other people might be running it.
Exactly.
Same thing in government, actually.
Yes.
Because you could have people who are in positions of, elected positions, appointed positions in leadership, doing nothing.
Exactly.
Not a thing. And then the real leaders are other people who have, used basic skills of leadership to organize communities and constituencies to actually get things done. And that is made possible by the internet, by modern communication, and so forth. And I think maybe you're talking a little about that.
I think it's really resonant about that. And what we're talking about too is understanding power dynamics and historical power kind of structures like parliaments or, senates and that hold power. But how do you move them if they're just kind of centered? Do we always assume that that's where power happens? Well, we know that social movements are able to do so many different things in resistance to this. And so this idea about having agency and being able to take up power in different ways is another way to think about leadership. And I think the kind of conventional way leadership is studied really just bogs it down in a particular understanding about what it is. So why I wanted to look at Indigenous artists is to say, okay, let's just kind of strip away. I'm going to go to what I know and see if leadership emerges here and what does it look like. And so I kept it very open. I'm a phenomenologist, so I studied the phenomenon and I let it emerge. Yes, I asked questions about leadership, but only about halfway into my interview. So I was trying to work out how people worked, what their artistic practice is, how they arrived at it, all of those things before asking about leadership. But you're trying to understand it. But even then, even my own work, is it okay to just start to talk to, say, you and get you to cognitively tell me about what you think leadership is?
Sure, it's okay.
Yeah, but does it tell us what it is? Because
Maybe
it's
not.
a process.
It's very subjective.
Exactly. And so I'm just really interested in all of that. And I think there's many years of thinking and pondering and working with people to find out more about it. But I think what I found really the most interesting thing is what people had to do inside of themselves. I call them territories of Indigenous leadership. Territories inside us that we have to navigate in order to do this work. That we have to think.
A personal way of looking at it.
Well, it's like, do you feel authorised to talk about this? Or do you need to go back to your community? Or are you in a specific culture culturally authorised to talk about this or have leadership in this moment? I mean, there's so many different things for Indigenous people to kind of work around in order to know if they can have leadership at that time. That's just one of the territories.
Let me offer you a thought. I'm not sure there's a good answer. You can always disagree with me. That's part of our deal here. But there's a guy named Jerry Cohen.
Okay.
He's a lawyer. He worked for William O. Douglas in the U.S. Supreme Court back in the 50s, I guess. Yale lawyer. And he decided one day that he was going to go to China. And he practiced law even before Nixon went to China. And an amazing man. Still there, and he's 80s, practicing law.
Yes.
Now, one of the things in China, there's a lot of taboos. If you want to talk about something that's a little taboo, you're going to get in trouble.
Sure.
You're going to get thrown out of the country or in jail, or both. And so his genius, in my view, Jerry Cohen, is that he can give them advice, he can remonstrate them, he can talk about things that are taboo, but his choice of words, and maybe it has to do with lawyering, is such that he doesn't offend them. And for that reason, he has been able to consult and advise Chinese leaders all these years, deal with the media, deal with all the forces in play. without being thrown in jail or out of the country. And maybe we're talking about something similar too.
Sure.
It's a matter of not stepping on the taboos. It's a matter of choice of words.
Yes.
It's a matter of not offending anybody.
Yes.
Are we talking about that?
I think that's exactly right, because you can imagine, just even imagining him, he's obviously very expert at doing this, and so perhaps it becomes quite natural for him to make those choices. But at first he would have had to find the boundaries of what he could and couldn't say, yeah? And he would have had to been really quite good at knowing that in order to not step over those boundaries in the first place and end up, as you say, in jail or kicked out of the country or something. So yeah, it's this inner work that we do that then becomes quite a part of the natural way in which we do things. And then there's sometimes that you just want to be fearless and you just want to say something, and you're going to stand out on the ledge and wear it for yourself as well, and you're going to self-authorize in that way, and you will have to bear the consequences. I mean, I think those are kind of interesting situations.
I want to ask you about the challenges. I told you I would, and we always ask our guests about the challenges. So here you are, and you're studying, navigating through leadership in the context of Indigenous art and entrepreneurship.
Yeah.
This is not particularly easy. It does require a lot of attention and thought, and it has its boundaries. It
Yes.
has its risks.
Yes.
Okay. What are the challenges for you? Where are the stumbling blocks in doing what you do?
For sure. One of the kind of questions that keeps coming up for me from other academics in particular when I present is they just go, why are you messing around with putting what you're studying with the word leadership? Perhaps it isn't leadership. And it really just causes me a great deal of reflection and sometimes grief to think about, this is the work that I'm trying to carve out. And, one of the challenges that I have is doing something that looks so different to what the field already does as leadership studies. So I have to, that's what I've chosen to do. And it just means that I'm going to have to be a really good writer and a researcher in order to try and demonstrate to the field that this is important, and it builds upon the knowledge that the field already has in it. So
What do you worry about? I mean, where are the false steps here? Where are the risks?
yeah, I think
What mistakes could you make that would get you in trouble doing what you do? What barriers
Yeah.
are out there that make it impossible for you to get where you want to go?
Sure. I think some of the missteps are that it is the method that I've chosen the way, as I said, asking people about what they do and leadership is, can that really tell me anything? Do I need to reconsider my entire research design? Perhaps I should go into something much more conventional and then branch out rather than doing something quite out there and trying to pull it back in. Maybe I'm not cut out to be in the leadership space and a management space. Maybe I need to return to the arts. I mean, all of the self-doubt and the kind of things that keep you up at night about it, but also making sure that I'm listening to the interviewees and the people I work with.
How about
enough.
How about the people who don't like what you're doing? The
Yeah.
people like you mentioned his name, the one who's working with Tony Abbott,
Sure.
trying to modify the statute about racist comments.
Yeah.
How much of a problem are they for you?
Well, I just don't focus on it really. Sure, it could be a problem. I could be called out. I could be called all the things that the people were when, like being a white Aborigine, being not Aboriginal, all of these sort of things. That has happened to me a lot in my life, and I guess for me, that doesn't bother me so much anymore because it's really not about what other people think. It's about who I am and who my family is and what we do in our culture and our community. It's so I don't feel under threat by that per se, but I understand that that is a possibility out there, and that I live in a very highly racialised society in Australia where my identity is open for that sort of thing.
One last question, Michelle, and that is, you're on a trip.
Yep.
You're on a voyage. Everybody is.
Yes.
How will you know that you've arrived? I mean, what is the vision you see for success in your efforts in this area?
Yeah, I'm just really excited to really provide a platform for Indigenous artists to have voice in their areas, and really now, Jay, for myself to be able to talk about and kind of synergize the things that I've been able to experience and talk about what I do. I think success for me, it looks so different. I've had so many different careers and I'm not sure where I'm going next. I can imagine, you know, setting up a foundation and supporting more young Indigenous artists to do the work that they want to do, or creating different things. I mean, there's so many things that I can do in the world, and I'm just really open to it. But success at the moment, certainly for this work, is being able to find the right academic argument to argue my way into the leadership studies
to articulate the position.
Completely,
yeah,
and
yeah.
That, believe it or not, it's really difficult to,
Sure.
to do it, even though you're right every day. I can't crack it sometimes.
Dr. Michelle Evans, Research Fellow, Asia Pacific Social Impact Leadership Center, having social impact on things in Melbourne, Australia, visiting with us today, courtesy Danielle Conway-Jones at the William S. Richardson School of Law. Thank you so much, Michelle. Thank you, Danielle. This is ThinkTech. We'll be back in a moment with Asia in Review, David Day, talking about the typhoon in the Philippines, Typhoon Haiyan. And thank you for watching. Aloha.